I love Bretonnians. Some would say a bit too much, but who cares what those honest curs think? Because the fact is, for me, this faction really represents Warhammer Fantasy really strongly, and they've been a constant in my hobby life since I started collecting Warhammer Fantasy when I was 15 with that 5th edition box set. Now, I've painted armies for them quite a few times over the years, and in fact this one right here is the 4th such army I've been collecting, and this one's inspired for the old world, and it's a bit of a work in progress still. Got a few units yet to add, things like Pegasus Knights, and I've got a great idea for a converted unit of Braille Knights. But if I'm honest with you, there is one miniature throughout all this time that I've always sort of avoided and not really given it the attention it deserves, because it is a fabulous miniature, but the fact is, it kind of intimidates me because of the detail on its colour scheme. But the time has come to face that, so in this video we're going to be taking this quest together, and we're going to be painting this. The Green Knight. The Green Knight is an absolutely beautiful miniature, and when you think about it, it's quite amazing because the model is almost 30 years old, and yet it still keeps on appearing frequently in the top 10 lists of the best miniatures that Games Workshop's ever made. So Michael Perry really did knock it out of the park with this one. Now, I built up the miniature with 2 separate sub-assemblies, which you can see just here. I have the Green Knight as a full piece just there, and I've also got his steed assembled separately too. Now, this is to allow ease of access to various details. The Green Knight I have mounted onto a paper clip to allow handling the base whilst painting him. But when it comes to the steed, there is something we need to take a look at, because in the box it rather enthusiastically comes with a base that has 2 slots in it. But these slots are actually really close together, and when you build the steed, you'll find its rear hooves are actually quite far apart, so it doesn't really fit. So instead, what I did was just swap out the base for one that's solid on top without the slots in, which you can see just here. And then at the back, I just cut in 2 holes to allow those little tabs to fit through. And then I green stuffed in the gaps there. So it's going to be nice and secure, and it's also going to be really smooth when we paint all that base as well. So what we need to do is get these 2 assemblies undercoated, and if you have access to one, what I recommend you go for is a pale green. Now, you don't have to, you can go for a grey undercoat if you want to and still follow this guide all the way through, but because green appears so often on the Green Knight, it's actually a very convenient starting point. So that's what I'm going to go for here. I'm going to use some Death Rattle green from the Colour Forge, but as I mentioned, you can go for grey if you prefer. Anyway, I'm going to go outside now and get these undercoated, and when we come back, we'll start painting. Here we have the 2 components undercoated with that Death Rattle green, so we're now ready to start painting. And for a model like this, I find the best place to begin is actually going to be on the steed painting its hair, because this is buried between loads and loads of layers of fabric and armour and things like that, so a lot of it's quite tricky to get to. So if we start with this, it doesn't matter if we catch surrounding details, because we'll clean up as we add further base coats onto the miniature. So with that in mind, what we want is a sort of dark, sort of slightly brownish grey for that natural feel to really lean into the character of this miniature. For that reason, I picked out Eidolon Grey, and to apply it, I'm just going to go for a rough base coating brush to get things going. So here I've got my medium base coat brush from Citadel. As usual, I'm just going to thin the paint down a touch on the palette so it's nice and smooth, and then it's time to start looking for all the parts of the steed that we can find underneath its armour and all the various details and things. So for example, its legs, of course, just want to block them in, and at this stage it doesn't really matter about catching surrounding areas, such as just around there, but also we do need to keep an eye out to make sure we get them all, including on the body, and of course the tail as well. Once that's all been picked out, the next thing I'm going to do is apply a black wash over the body of the horse, and here I'm going to be using some Oblivion black wash. And again, we're doing this very early on now because it doesn't matter if any surrounding details get splashed as we apply it. So this means to actually paint it on, we can use quite a large brush. I'm going to go for a medium shade brush here from Citadel, and it's a matter of just loading up a generous amount, then painting it directly over all the off black that we've got here on the steed. So for example, on its legs around here, I'm going to start applying it and pushing it around, making sure to really work it into all the nooks and crannies as I go along here like this. Now once it's been applied, I'm going to give it around about half an hour to dry to make sure it's completely dry before moving on to the next step. And it is important just to check as it's drying that it isn't really pooling too much in any one particular area, because some of the detail can get quite fine, in particular some of the hairs that we've got around the back of the legs just there. So if you do happen to spot a large amount of wash building up such as that, just use your brush like a sponge just to soak away the excess and then redistribute it elsewhere around the miniature. Now that's done, the next thing to do is to clean up some of that colour on the horse's hair by doing some layering, and for this I'm going to go back to that original colour I used. So it's back to Eidolon Grey here, and to apply it I'm going to go for a medium to small brush for some accuracy. So this is a size 0 from Artsopus. It's a little bit smaller than a medium layer brush from Citadel, but the key thing on a brush like this is that it holds a good point, because this way we'll have lots of control as we reapply it. Because now what I'm aiming to do is to paint the colour onto the flatter regions of the detail we're doing here, whilst avoiding the recesses. And a very clear example of that is going to be this part of the horse's body. I'm going to concentrate in the middle of this region here where it's really flat and smooth, but as we get to the corner where it meets that saddle strap, I'm going to go quite into the recess so as to keep that dark shading that we've got. Same is true as we get close to the barding just there. This is going to be true on the legs where it gets a little bit more complex, but it's still the same process. You can see on the knee just here, it's going to concentrate on the flat parts of it, such as around there, but as we get to the upper leg, it's time to skip past that little recess just there, carry on again on this muscle here, again skipping the recess beneath it and picking out this muscle too. So it's like this across all of its body. Now when it comes to the tail, I can actually approach this quite differently. It's possible to go in with the side of the brush like this and just skim along it, because this way you'll only catch the raised strands and really start to bring out that texture. With that layering done, the next thing to do is to begin highlighting the horse, and here I'm going to stick to those slightly brownish greys by using some rodent grey, and to apply it I'm going to go for the same brush. So the size 0 once again, because it's got a really good point on this one, so it'll allow that accuracy as we start to pick out certain features. And basically what we're looking to do now is to emphasize parts that are going to catch the light. So it's going to be edges and corners and things that stand out really. So for example, if we take a look at the leg, it's going to be things such as these corners that we've got that go around the knees. So just here, for example, it's going to run a bit of that colour along that ridge there, and same here and down the side just here as well. And then when we get further back to where these muscles are, we're looking for where they catch the light, such as right there and then just there. Now, in addition, I'm going to be going quite heavy on certain parts, because if you look at the box artwork, there are some areas where the hair tends to go, well, almost up to a white, such as on the end of the tail. And so to begin the process for this, I'm going to go quite heavy on basically layering and almost base coating in a way as we go down here, allowing some of that colour to run into the more shallow recesses as I go along. Once you've finished applying that highlight, you can see it helps bring that detail out there on the body of the horse. And if you take a look at the tail, you can see how strong I've been with that colour towards the end of it. Done the same thing too on these little bits of hair that we've got directly above each hoof. And so with that done, we can now go even lighter with a light grey. And here I'm going to use some Carcharodon grey. I've decided to stick to the size 0 brush to apply it, because this one's holding a really good point, but you might want to go for a smaller brush. The choice really is yours. But with this one, we need to thin the paint down so it's a little bit translucent on the palette. So just add that touch of water to bring it down to there. And then what I'm going to do is remove the excess paint off my brush on the tissue, draw up fresh, because this way we ensure we don't have too much paint on the brush. Because now with the tip of it, what we're looking to do is exaggerate these parts that we were highlighting earlier with a finer line of this colour. So if we take a look at the leg around here, for example, you can see the highlights I put on previously. It's going to add a fine light grey line in the middle of them to exaggerate them even more. So just around there, just retracing our steps from the previous stage. Same as down here, and then we've also got the muscles back here where again, just want to pick them out with a fine line of this colour. I'm changing the angle of the miniature to make sure I'm comfortable, to really help out and get those lines as narrow as possible. So there, for example, and then just there as well. And it's really a matter of just doing that all across the body. Now, when it comes to these parts where we want the colour to get lighter, such as around here on the tail, I'm going to be doing the highlight in that way I was doing earlier with the side of the brush, but I'm purposely going to allow it to go quite heavy as I do this to make the colour quite strong towards the bottom of the tail. Now, as I go further up, I want to make sure it's lighter, so I'll just make sure there's not much paint in the brush, but I just use my finger there like that to remove the excess. And here it's just going to be a very light skimming motion just to get a bit of this colour up here. But again, as I mentioned, as we get further down, just allow the brush to get heavier. With that highlight now applied, we can just move a little bit further for the parts of the hair that need to be closer towards white. And here I'm going to go for two colours, starting out with an ivory. So here I'm using some ivory tusk. Then it's time to press on into a pure white. So in this case, I can use some white star just to finish off those lighter parts. But first of all, we need some ivory tusk, and to apply it, I'm going to stay with the same brush, using that size 0 once again. And with this one, you just want to thin it down, but I'm really looking to make sure the paint is a little bit translucent here. So down to about that sort of point there. Then remove the excess off the brush to ensure that we're not overloaded here. And then what I'm going to do with this is start applying it onto these parts where we want it to be white, such as the hair around the hooves just here. And this time I'm just going to be applying it as a series of lines on the peaks of these bits of hair. So just very gently apply to the tip of the brush there like that, just to push them a little bit further and make them lighter. On the tail, it's going to be a matter of using the side of the brush once again. So again, I'm just going to make sure there's not much paint on the brush, just using my thumb there. And then with the side, I'm just going to skim along just to highlight these areas down here. And once that's done, we can then move on to a pure white. So here I've got some white star, and this is just going to be a fine highlight on the ends of these hairs. So for example, just along here above the hoof, on the tail, it's going to be just down on the end of it down here. And with that highlight applied, we've now finished doing the black body of the horse underneath all that fabric and armour. And so now what we can do is actually turn to look at the armour, because it's time to basically get all the silver details on the miniature. And here we want to do that silver that's got that subtle green tint to it. So the first stage for doing it is to just establish a good solid base coat of a silver. I'm going to use Surcoat Silver for this. I'm going to turn to the actual Green Knight's body to illustrate this, but there is some armour that appears on the horse, so that's going to be done in the same way at the same time. But because the Green Knight doesn't have anything done on him just yet, I'm going to go back to my medium base coat brush for applying it, because it can be nice and rough with this one. As usual, the paint just needs to be thinned down with that touch of water, and then it's time to look for all the plate armour that appears on the miniature. So for example, on his leg just here, I'm just going to roughly block this in at this stage. Here we have all that silver base coated, so the next thing to do is apply a wash over the top, and here what we want to do is make sure we get that subtle green hint in it. So rather than just using a black wash, I'm actually going to use a mix of a black and a sort of emerald green wash. So the ones I've got are Oblivion Black Wash and also Orc Flesh Wash at a roughly 50-50 ratio. What we need to do is mix them together on the palette. Now to begin with, I am going to be using that medium shade brush once again, because I'm going to start out on the knight, but when it comes to applying this onto the steed on the armour there, we want a little bit more control, so it's a good idea to switch to a smaller brush in that case. But the brush this size is going to be ideal for the initial parts. Once that's thoroughly mixed together, you can see we've got that nice dark green, and so all we need to do is paint it directly over the silver. So for example, if we go back to the leg once again just here, it's just a matter of painting it straight over the top so it runs into all that recessed detail. Once that mix is completely dry, we'll be left with the shading there on those silver details, and of course that green tint too, but it has dulled things down quite a bit. So now it's a good idea just do a little bit of layering with the silver before we move into highlighting these features. So to do this, I'm going to go back to that original silver, which in our case is Surcoat Silver. And to apply it this time, I'm going to revert back to my size 0 brush, because now we need that control, because it's the same sort of thing as what we did in that horse when we did the layering earlier on. We're basically looking to concentrate on the flatter regions and avoid the recesses. So once that paint's thinned down, we're going to be ready to apply it. And we do want it to be thinned down so it's a bit translucent, so some of that green shows through. It needs to be subtle, but just a little hint of it will look quite nice in the overall finish of the miniature. So with that prepared, we can start applying it, and we're aiming for areas such as the armour, again on the leg just here. You can see we've got all these angles and things, and we're looking for the recesses where we need to avoid. So for example, on this plate right here, I'm going to concentrate on this flat part just here, but when I get close to the recess next to that ridge right there, I'm not going to go quite to the corner so as to retain that green shading. Instead, I'm just going to pick out that raised ridge, carry on again, skipping past that recess right next to it, and continuing on up here. With that done, the shine will be returned onto all of that silver, so the next thing to do is apply a highlight onto it. And in this case, we need a really bright silver, so I'm going to use some Mithril Blade. And once that's done, there are some select details which we need to block out with a pitch black. So here I'm going to use some Doom Death Black. But we'll start out with that Mithril Blade, and to apply this one, I've actually switched down to a really fine brush here. This is a size 00 from Artisopus. It's about the same sort of size as a small layer brush from Citadel, so quite a small one, quite fine. Ideal for this kind of thing because it allows lots of control. And with it, we just need to get some of that paint thinned and ready, as usual, adding in small amounts of water at once until it's down to about this sort of consistency. And then with that prepared, we can start looking for all the edges and angles that appear on the armour. Now, one of the great things about this miniature is that a lot of the edges are actually fluted up, and so it's very easy to approach them with the side of the brush. So for example, the armour on the leg just here. And all we need to do is just skim along with the side of the brush like this, and it's easy to get a sharp, clean highlight really quickly and really easily. Just be sure that when you're doing it like this, you keep changing the model around so that you're nice and comfortable as you apply the highlight. Now, you won't be able to get all of them like this because some of these edges are a little bit tricky to reach with the side of the brush, such as this central ridge we've got coming down the leg here. In this case, just line the miniature up so you're looking straight at it and paint in a downward motion like this, following the peak of this part of the armour. And with all that silver highlighted, we can now move on to a pitch black. So here I've got some Doom Death Black, and this is for the inside of the visor and also the banner poles on the back. And with that, all of that silver armour is now complete, and we've got that black marked in too, so we can move on to the next feature, which is quite a small one, but it is important we get it out of the way now. That is to paint in all the leather, and here what you want to get things started is a really sort of dark, cold brown. So I'm going to use some scorched earth for this. Once that's done, we should apply a black wash over the top, so here I'm going to go back to some Oblivion black wash. But first of all, we need that dark brown, so I'm using some scorched earth, and to apply it, I'm going to be using my size 0 brush mostly, because some of this is quite tricky to get to, and some can be quite small. So a brush like this is ideal for this sort of thing. But for some larger areas like the saddle, you might want to switch to a larger one. The choice is yours. Whatever you decide, all you got to do is get this thinned and ready, and then we can start blocking these features in. And if we take a look at the horse, that's going to be the saddle around here, including the strap that goes down here. But also there are some straps that are around its face that we want to get to, such as just in here. With the base coat done, we're then ready to apply a black wash over the top of the leather. So here I'm using some Oblivion black wash, and I'm sticking to a size 0 brush to apply it, just for areas like this where we're close to details we've painted so far, just to keep it under control and just on the leather. Once that wash is completely dry, we can then begin highlighting all the leather, and for this I'm going to be starting out with some Ancient Forest, so a little bit lighter than our original base coat, and then we can push even further than that with a lighter brown. Here I'm going to go for some Wasteland Brown. But first I'm going to use some Ancient Forest, and to apply it I'm switching to my small brush, so it's down to that size 00, because with this we just need to pick out all the edges on these straps. Now when it comes to the saddle, we don't actually have to do all of it, because honestly the knight himself covers most of it, so you don't need to worry about all the padding and things like that. So when you're doing the steed, don't worry about doing the interior part, but definitely make sure you go around the outside, such as just here, where we can use the side of the brush just to skim along this raised up edge that we've got, so just along there, and then turn the model to make sure we can access along here too. Now when it comes to the finer straps, it's a matter of just using the tip of your brush to pick out the edges, such as this one right here. And all you got to do is line up and paint in a downward motion. And you can, if you want to, allow your brush just to dot a little bit as you go along to start to create the impression of a bit of texture there on the leather that we can emphasize with the next highlight. And now that's done, it's time to add a finer highlight with some Wasteland Brown. And with this one, what I'm looking for are any little dots and things that we applied in doing that previous highlight, that slightly rough approach. And what I'm going to do is just add a few little dots of this colour onto those parts, just to exaggerate that appearance of cracked leather even more. Now that's done, the leather is finished, so it's time for the big one, because now what we need to do is start putting the green onto the barding, and at the same time we can do the surcoat on the Green Knight. And to do this, what we need to do is create a real pale green here, so I'm going to be doing a mix to get things going. What I've got is ethereal green, so already quite a bright green, but I'm going to be mixing in some white star to it at about a 50-50 ratio. So you've got the two colours next to each other on the palette, and to do this I'm actually going to be using my medium base coat brush to get things going. So I'm going to mix these two together until we get a nice even tone of the two colours. So just keep on stirring, keep on going until you get to a colour that is going to be sort of like this, you see, so quite a pale, quite a light green there, like that. So I've got that mixed up. Just going to make sure the brush is clean so we don't overdo this. And you can see I do also have my size 0 brush on hand. Now I'm going to be using that as we go. This big brush is great to get things started though, because when it comes to the barding on the steed, it's actually very open, so a brush like this is good for a lot of it. So for example, if we load up and start applying it, we're looking at areas such as the fabric around here. We just need to block it in entirely at this stage. So just get a good base coat on this area, looking to get it as even as possible, so be sure to apply it as two thin coats. Now the reason why I've got that smaller brush is for when we get close to details we've done already. So for example, as we're getting close to the horse around here, I'm just going to switch to the size 0 brush, and this will allow just a bit more accuracy as we start to work our way along here. Here we have that nice bright base coat applied on all the fabric, and we are going to go even lighter with this, but before doing so, what we should do is get the shading on all this fabric. And to do this, we're going to go through two steps, starting out by applying a wash onto it. And here we want a green wash, so I'm going to be using some orc flesh wash, but straight out the bottle it's going to be a little bit too strong for our purposes here, because we mustn't darken things down too much on flat areas. So I'm going to be mixing it with some Lamia medium, which will ensure it retains the same properties of a wash and dries nice and smooth, but it means the colour is going to be just a little bit weaker. So what we need to do is create this on the palette, and to do so I'm going to be using my medium shade brush. You can see I've got a little puddle here of orc flesh wash already, and I'm just going to get some of the Lamia medium next to it on the palette. Now I want to err on the side of the medium here to make sure that the colour's fairly weak, so I'm just going to build it up to look to create a roughly 2:1 ratio here in favour of the medium. So you see a good puddle of the medium there. I'm just going to grab some of the green and start mixing that in to create our wash, and I'm aiming for strength kind of like this, you see, so nicely diluted. And with that mixed, it's then time to start applying it across all this green fabric on the barding, the reins, and on the surcoat. Now I'm going to be starting out by using this brush to apply this onto the larger, more open areas that appear on the steeds, such as around the back just here. But when it becomes more detailed, such as on the surcoat, it's a good idea to switch to a smaller brush in those areas. But it's just a matter of painting it on, working it into all the nooks and crannies as you go. With that wash dry, we've now got some really nice definition appearing on all of that fabric, but we can still do a little bit more shading, and also at the same time we do need to pick out some select details with a really dark green, and this is for things like the underside of the barding. So for this, what I'm going to use is some wyvern green, and to apply it I'm mostly going to use my size 0 brush, but you might want to have a smaller one on hand. Basically a brush with a good point is essential during this stage, and what we're going to do with this is first of all thin that paint down and then start looking for really deep recessed areas where we want just a little bit more definition. Now in the barding, a great example for that is going to be the underside of the various layers that we've got. So if we take a look here, you can see we've got all these, well, 3 layers on each side essentially. What we want to do with this colour is just run it directly into the corners on the underside. So just in here, just to get a nice sharp bit of contrast between the different layers of fabric. So you just need to run it in like this, just being as neat as possible, just trying to hone it into that corner. Now, in addition, keep an eye out for any undersides of the fabric that you can see, and also these little recessed parts we've got towards the bottom. So you can see these parts just here. We just want to make these kind of fade away a little bit, and we can do that by just painting some dark green into them, just there. But also, every now and then you'll have parts folded back, such as just here. You want to paint the underside of these parts here for the underside of the fabric, and also any bits underneath the miniature you can see, be sure to block them in. It's a little bit tricky to see here, but you can spot some of the inside of the barding just underneath there. So I'm going to make sure I paint this dark green as well. Once you finish that step, you'll be left with some really strong contrast there between the light and the dark. So it's time to move on to make this lighter by really going towards that pale green by making some more mixes. So here we're going to be going back to ethereal green and white star once again, but this time I'm going to start mixing up a colour that's a bit lighter. So I'm going to be putting a bit more white in there. So what we need to do is create this on the palette, and this time I'm going to be using my size 0 brush for it, because here we are going to be doing some layering. So we're going to be looking to avoid certain details as we apply this colour. So this is a good size for a lot of it. Now what I'm going to do is mix these together, but this time I'm just leaning a bit more into the white. So not massively, but I'm just looking to make a paler tone. So we're aiming for something kind of like that this time. Now once you've got that thin prepared, we can thin it down with that touch of water, and then also need to be careful not to overdo it, because when you're using this brush to mix the colour, we'll get quite a bit of paint on it. So just make sure it's clean and load up fresh, and then we're ready to start applying it. Now this time we want to start focusing on flatter regions whilst avoiding recesses. So if we take a look at the fabric around here, that means that areas such as the back of the horse, it's nice and easy just to layer it onto parts like this. But you do need to be careful when you get down to the little fleur-de-lis designs here, because there is actually a recess in each one. So look at this one here, for example, you can see the edges of it are fluted up. So we want to make sure that we just focus this into the middle of this design there like that, being careful not to go into the corners around it. But because the outer edge is raised up, we also want to pick that up too. So it just means just carefully skimming along with the side of your brush to pick that out as well. Now, same process going to be true on the surcoat for the Green Knight himself. So just remember to take your time, be as neat as possible, and look to avoid all those recesses. With that stage done, you can see now it's really lifted that colour and made it nice and clean. So it's time to move into highlighting it. And here again, we're going to be doing some mixing to begin with the same 2 colours. So I'm going to be starting out with ethereal green and white star, but this time going much more into white star. And once that's finished, we can just use white star on its own for a fine highlight. First of all, we need to do the mix. So this is ethereal green and white star once again. And you can see I've actually got the previous mix I used in that last step. So this is about a 2-to-1 ratio in favor of white over green. I've got some more white on the side, and what I'm going to do is just mix up an even lighter color of it to get a very, very pale version of it. So this time we're looking for something kind of like that. You see a very pale minty green, and with that mixed up with this, we're now going to start picking out all the features that really stand out. So for example, on the horse's barding, that means it's going to be these little bits of trim that we've got, such as around here, where we're looking for that outer edge, and we want to skim along all the way around. So very carefully, just picking out that fine detail. Also, we want to look out for any peaks on creases. So you can see there's quite a strong one that runs down there. It's going to very thinly apply this towards the top of this area to help it stand out too. So just very gently applied, very thinly there like that to build up a highlight in that region. And then finally, we've got the reins just here, which need to be a little bit lighter than the surroundings. So for the reins, I'm actually going to be layering instead, looking to focus on the raised flatter parts and just be careful to avoid those deeper recesses whenever you encounter them. And then finally, it's time to just use your white on its own. So here I've got white star alone, and with this, it's time to apply a highlight onto the reins to separate them from the surrounding green fabric. And so here we want to go around the outer edge and also look for the peaks and any creases on the fabric, such as around here, and pick them out with the tip of the brush. And with that, all the green fabric is now completed, which as you can see forms a massive part of the miniature. But I know what you're thinking, we haven't painted those vine patterns on there yet, and that is of course the thing that intimidates me, but don't worry about that. We are going to come back to that later on. We're not doing it just yet though, because what I want to make sure that we do first is paint some colours that surround these details, just in case any mistakes happen and we catch some of the barding and things as we're doing them. This way it's easy to clean things up without the vines on there yet. So we'll come back to it after this next stage, which is to paint a real strong emerald green on various details. Now I am going to be using emerald green as the base coat here, and to apply it I'm going to stick to my size 0 brush, but of course feel free to change as you need to. With this there are some select features that we need to block in at this stage. Now first of all it's going to be the plumes, and of course there's one on the horse, but we have one on the Green Knight himself too, so we're looking at this plume just up here. Want to base coat the entire thing. We also want to make sure that we base coat to the face of his shield, so all this texture on here, and on his chest there's a fleur-de-lis just here. Want to make sure we pick this out at this stage as well. Now that we've got those details base coated, we can apply a wash on them to get some shading, and here what I'm going to go for is that same dark green wash for a mix that we used on the armour. So this is going to be Orc Flesh Wash and also Oblivion Black Wash at about a 50-50 ratio. To do so, I'm using the size 0 brush again. You can see I've got them both next to each other on the palette. All we've got to do is just thoroughly mix them together so we get that dark green. And with that prepared, it's then just a matter of painting this onto this new emerald green details that we picked out with that colour. So once you've got it prepared, we can load up and start painting it onto these parts. And it's going to be the shield, the plumes, and also the fleur-de-lis on his chest. Once that wash is dry, we can then take these colours a little bit further, and because they're so densely textured, we can actually do a bit of dry brushing here. So that's what I'm going to do, starting out by using emerald green once again. Then we want to go lighter with some ethereal green. But we'll start out with emerald green, and for this colour, and in fact for both of them, we are mostly dry brushing, but there is a little bit of layering we need to do too. So I've got 2 brushes here ready for it. I've got a small dry brush from Citadel, and I've also got my size 0 brush, which I'll be switching to in a second. But with emerald green, what we want to do is make sure we start out by dry brushing it with the small dry brush. So here we go, small dry brush from Citadel. Just need a small amount of this on the tip of the bristles, then get some tissue and use it to work the paint into the brush whilst also removing the excess. Now carry on until you're down to about this sort of point just here, and then you're ready to start applying it. And throughout this, just take care to avoid surrounding details and instead just concentrate on the main area of these parts. Now it's nice and easy to get the shield here where we can just brush across like this, and what will happen is the colour will start to collect on the raised up flatter areas and all that texture whilst not dropping into the recesses, so it brightens up that green once again but retains the shading that we got from the wash. Same's true on the plume, and it's when you're doing the plume that you do need to take care, because we've got to keep a short distance away from the helmet and those banner poles at the back there like that, just making sure we really focus on the main central area. And the reason why we need to do a little bit of layering as well at this stage is because of that fleur-de-lis that we've got just there on the chest. And this is too shallow to really do with dry brushing, and it would go horribly wrong if we tried. So instead, I'm switching to the size 0 brush, and with this, I'm just going to be layering this detail. So just carefully applying the paint onto the flat regions, just there like that, whilst avoiding recesses. Once you've finished doing that, we can move on up to a lighter green. So here I've got ethereal green, and to begin with, again, I'm going to dry brush it on, and this time it's quite a light flicking motion to really bring out the texture. You can see that on the face of the shield. Same is going to be true on the plume. Again, taking care not to go too close to any surrounding details, but remember that fleur-de-lis in the chest requires some layering instead. So in this case, it's the same color, so still ethereal green, switching to the size 0 brush and just layering it directly over the top of this design. Here you can see the result of that dry brushing, really bringing out the texture of those details, but now we can take them a little bit further by doing some highlighting in a slightly more controlled fashion. And for this, we want an even brighter green now. So I'm going to be using some talisman green for this, and then we should go for a pale yellow just to finish it off. And here I'm going to use some craven yellow. But we'll start out with talisman green, and to apply this one, I've actually decided to go for the size 0 brush again, but you might want to go for a smaller brush. The choice is yours. So the reason why I'm using this one is because the point is holding really well on it. So it's going to give lots of accuracy on some of this fine detail. Now with this, we just need to make sure the paint's thinned down and brought down to a point where it's a little bit translucent and ever so slightly inky, so about that sort of consistency there. Then remove the excess off your brush and load up fresh, because with this we just want small amounts, because now we're looking to pick out the finest, sharpest edges that appear on these details. So I'll start on the shield, and for the outside of it we can just skim along with the side of the brush like this to get that bright green line around the outer edge. You can see just skimming along very gently like that there just to build it up. And then we can use it on some of the detail that appears on here. Now for the actual face that's in the middle, there's going to be a slightly different shade of green later on. So really we're concentrating on the leaves that are surrounding it. And for each one, just do a quick line on the outer edge. So just around these parts here, for example, just along there. Now when it comes to the design on the chest, this is going to be more or less an edge highlight going around the outside of this fleur-de-lis design. So with the tip of the brush, we just want to very carefully follow the outer edge, such as these lines right here. And then with the plumes, just approach the side of the brush and just skim along these raised up ridges that we've got that go along the length of them. So very carefully along areas like this. And then finally, we can add a very fine highlight with a pale yellow. So here I've got some craven yellow, and we've got to be careful not to overdo this one so as to turn the shield more yellow. So I've switched to a smaller brush for a bit more control. This is the size 00, and you can see I'm focusing on sharper corners and angles. So for example, on the shield there, I'm just really honing in on that corner. When it comes to the leaves, we just want to make sure we're applying a small amount of this to the tip of each one. So just very gently into areas like this, for example. On the fleur-de-lis design on the chest, it's going to be the same process of really looking for the sharpest bits. So very close towards the tip of it, just in there like that with that bright colour. And then we can also add a bit of this on the plume just towards the top of it on this rounded edge up here. Again, using the side of the brush just to skim on a little bit of this colour. With that, those emerald green parts are now fully highlighted, so we can turn our attention to that face in the middle of the shield. And I used to actually wonder to myself, why has he got a creepy, weird face in the middle of a shield here? Why is he not got fleur-de-lis or something like that? But it suddenly occurred to me, it's the face of the Green Man, which is like a reference to English folklore, which I think is really nice. But for this, it's going to make it a slightly different shade of green, so slightly more like a sort of woodeny kind of green. And to do it, we're going to start out by picking it out with some gung-ho green, then we can highlight that with some green beret. So moving towards some olive tones for this one. We'll start out with gung-ho green, and to apply this, I'm going to be using the size 0 brush here. And what we want to do is get that thinned and ready as usual. And here I'm going to be applying it as a layer just on that face in the very middle of the shield. So once it's thinned and ready, we can start doing that. And we just want to look for the parts that are standing out. So the raised up textures, such as the nose right here. I just want to apply it as a layer in that region. But whilst we're putting this on, just be careful not to drop into those deeper recesses so as to retain that dark green in those areas. What we're going to do is just bring this out to the part where you get all the leaves growing out of the face. So just around here, for example, just under the forehead, just bringing it up to about there. Once the base coat's done, we're then ready to move on to a lighter olive green to apply a highlight. And in this case, I'm using some green beret, and I'm using the size 0 brush again to put this on. And it's just a matter of looking for all the edges and angles and carefully picking them out. With the face brought up to this point, it's now time for a fine highlight on there, and what we want to do is kind of bring it in line with the rest of the shield. So I'm going to be mixing a colour together using the same yellow that we used for that surrounding green. So that means craven yellow is going to be used here, and we'll mix it into the green beret colour that we used in that previous step. And to do it, I'm going for the small brush here down to that size 00, and what I'm going to do is just mix these two colours together on the palette. So here they are, just get a little bit of green beret and pull in a bit of craven yellow and get a very sort of pale, sort of olivey colour there like that. With that mixed up, we can get that thinned down, and we don't need very much of this because this is just going to be a fine highlight on this area. And all we're now looking for is the sharpest features and details, and we just want to carefully go in and just pick them out. So for example, the end of the nose just along here, just using the tip of the brush. Now we've got that done. To finish off the shield, all we need to do is paint in the eyes of the green man on there, and to do this we're going to go for a turquoise, so blue but keeping an element of that green in there. And the first stage is going to be to base coat them using some cursed blue, and then we need to go brighter. Here I'm going to use some ray gun glow, then to finish off we want a touch of a pure white, so here I'm going to use some white star. But we'll start out with cursed blue, and to apply it definitely go for your smallest brush, so I'm using my size 00 here, and whilst I'm going to illustrate this on the shield, I am going to be painting the eyes of the steed at the same time in the same way. But for the first step, just get that paint thinned down and then brace your hands to be as steady as possible. Carefully go in with the tip of the brush and just base coat all the eyes at this stage. With that done, it's then time to move on to our brighter blue. So here I've got some ray gun glow, and what we need to do with this is just paint it towards the middle of each eye, leaving that previous blue still showing around the outside. And then finally, it's time to move on to a pure white. So here I've got some white star, and with this all we need to do is apply a very small amount into the middle of each eye. And with that done, the shield is now complete, and you can see I've also painted in the eyes on the shadow steed as well. And so with that done, we're now going to move on to the next area of colour, which is actually going to be the gold. Now I know what you're thinking, Duncan, what about those vines? You're just putting it off, aren't you? And well, yes, you might be right. But the thing is, it's a good idea to paint the gold now because I've realised there's actually some around the Green Knight's waist, and I don't want this to get in the way of the vines either. So we're going to do that now, get it out of the way, and then do the vines afterwards. So I'm going to start out with some dragon's gold here for the base coat, and then for a wash, I'm going to be using some flesh wash for a nice sort of warm brown shading on there to give it some warmth. And then for the highlight, I'm going to use some glistening gold. But first of all, it's time for the base coat. So I'm going to use dragon's gold here, and to apply it, I'm using the size 0 brush for this one. You might want to go for a smaller one if you prefer. The choice really is yours. But with this, we just need to look for all the gold details and block them in. Now, when it comes to the shadow steed, there's a bit of gold around its mouth for the bit, but for the knight, what we've got are some gold details around the waist, because there's these like little plates just here on the belt, which I want to very carefully go in and base coat these. There's also a little bit of gold around here in the form of a buckle, so just there. And of course, there is his sword to do, where the whole crossguard and pommel is gold. So be sure to base coat these two at this stage. Once you've base coated all the gold, you're then ready to apply some flesh wash over the top. And here I'm still using the size 0 brush because we do need to be careful, especially here on the belt. It's very important that you focus it just on the gold and keep it off all the surrounding green. And with that wash now completely dry, we can move on to glistening gold, and this is going to be an edge highlight. So again, be especially careful when you're doing the belt, but we're looking for all the edges and angles and just want to very gently pick them out. And with that, the gold is complete, and so now it's time to move on to the sword blade. And yes, I know I said I was going to be doing the vines now, but actually I'm going to do them after the sword blade, because that blade is the final detail that we have to paint on the miniature to have painted everything, which means that then the vines are going to be entirely optional, so it'll be up to you whether you do them or not. And yes, of course, I am putting it off as long as possible. But for that sword blade, what we need to do is start out with an emerald green to start to build up that magical effect. So I'm going to be using emerald green for the base coat, and to apply it, I'm using my size 0 brush once again. And so for this first step, all you got to do is block the entire thing in as smoothly as possible. So as usual, thin that paint down with a little bit of water, then it's just a matter of base coating all of it, just being really careful when you get close to the crossguard. With the base coat done, we're now ready to move on to the next step on the sword, which is to introduce some shading onto that central part of it using a dark green. And the plan is to glaze this on, gradually building it up so it gets stronger towards the crossguard at the very base of the blade. Now to do this, I'm going to use some wyvern green, and I recommend you go for a medium small brush for it. So I'm using my size 0 here. And to do this, we just need to get some of this paint heavily thinned down. So I'm just going to grab some of it there, then add quite a bit of water to it to create a very, very thin version of the paint. Now, as I move away from the main blob of paint there, you can see this is the sort of strength of paint that we're looking for. So very thin, very inky. And once you've got that mixed up, just remove excess off your brush here, because it's important that you only put on a small amount at once. This is to avoid surface tension of the water, basically pulling the paint out of shape. So by only loading up a small amount, you're going to avoid that happening. So with that on your brush, we can then start applying it, and the goal now is to apply it on that central part of the sword, starting from around about here and just going all the way down to the base of the blade. Now, if you put it on thin enough, you'll find that actually it dries really fast, because in fact it's dry already, which means we can go in for a second coat a little bit further down and apply it in the same way, going all the way down to the base of the blade. And basically what you do is just carry on doing this, getting further and further down so that you build up that wyvern green until it becomes solid wyvern green at the very base of the sword. With that done, we've now got that gradient there on the central part of the blade. So now we can move on to the outside of the blade where things need to be much lighter. So we've got a base coat with a much lighter green now. I'm going to use some talisman green for this. And to apply it, I'm going to use the same brush, that's size 0 once again. And with it, we're just looking for a fresh base coat here. So as usual, make sure the paint's thinned down. And once you've got your brush loaded and ready, we can start applying it to this region. And it's going to be the cutting edge on either side. So for example, just along here, we can approach the side of the brush and just skim along this flat region right here to get a sharp line between the two tones of green. So all the way down this side, and the same on the other side as well. With that brighter green now established, we can push that on even lighter by doing some more glazing here. And now we want to start going into more sort of yellowy tones. So I'm going to be using talisman green once again, but I'm going to mix it with some craven yellow to make the new colour. So what we need to do is create that on the palette first of all. I'm still using the size 0 brush for this, and I'm looking for a roughly 50-50 mix. So I'm just going to grab some craven yellow and some of the talisman green and start putting them together. I think I'm going to err slightly more on the side of the yellow to make the colour quite popping. So that's the sort of thing that we're looking for. And with that mixed up and ready, we can then turn it into a glaze just like we did with that darker green earlier on. So I'm just going to make a very thin version of it, just drawn away from the main body of paint. So there we go. Then remove excess paint off the brush just to make sure that there's not much on there. And then it's a matter of loading up fresh, and then we can start glazing this onto that outer cutting edge. This is going to be on both sides. What we want to do is gradually start moving towards the tip this time. So if I start around here, I just want to gradually go up like that with that thin coat so it dries nice and quickly. Then once that's set, we can go in for another tone and just move a little bit further up. So just about there, and basically just going to carry on doing this again and again until we get that solid colour at the very tip of the sword. Once you've built that blade up to this point, we're then ready to move on to making it even brighter towards the very tip. So here again, we're going to use that mix, but make it lighter. So that mix in the previous step, which was talisman green and craven yellow, we're now going to introduce some white to it with some white star. Now, once that's done, we just need to edge highlight the blade of the sword. So we'll start out with some craven yellow on its own this time for the darker parts, then some white star for the lighter parts. But first of all, we need to make our mix. So remember, this is going to be talisman green, craven yellow, and white star. And on the palette, I'm going to be doing it using my size 0 brush once again. We've got that mix from the previous stage just there. So all I'm going to do is grab some white and start mixing that into it to make an even lighter version of it. So really mix that in to get that very pale colour just there. We can then, just like before, thin it down because this is going to be another glaze. So just add that water into it as you need to until it's nice and thin. Then remove the excess paint off your brush. Load up fresh, and then we're ready to start applying it. And it's that same motion as what we were just doing, but now even more focused towards the tip of the sword. So we're looking at starting about here now. We just want to gradually apply this colour thinly up to the very tip there, like that. With that sword at this point now, we can move on to some craven yellow on its own, and this is going to be the first edge highlight, and it's mainly for the darker areas down towards the base of the blade, but here we just want to use the side of the brush where possible just to skim along up to the point where it basically disappears around about there. But you can see towards the bottom, it stands out really nicely against that green. We also want to get this as a line between the dark green and the light green. Now this is going to be a case of just holding the model as steady as possible and painting with a downward motion with the tip of the brush and just running that line along between these two colours. And once you've finished with the yellow, it's then time to move on to white. So here I've got some white star, and with this we just need to carry on the edge highlights just at the very tip of the blade where it's lighter. And once you've finished applying that final highlight, the blade of his sword is completed. And so now, honestly, I've got nowhere else to hide. Now it's time to paint those vines. I did promise I was going to, so now it's time to actually do it. Now, before we do start doing this, it's worth checking where the model is at the moment, because if you've ever been intimidated by this model because you don't want to have to do this, honestly, you don't actually have to at all. Because if you take a look where the model is right now, honestly, if you just stuck that together, put the banners on the back banner poles and did the base, it's going to look fantastic on the battlefield. So don't feel too intimidated by this part. It is entirely optional. But if you decide you do want to paint the vines, what I recommend you do is pick out a good emerald green colour. Now, I'm going to use the appropriately named emerald green for this. And what you want is a brush that holds a good point, but not necessarily a really small brush, because you want a bit of a body in there, so it's going to hold enough paint that's at the right sort of consistency, so basically it lasts for a while. If you go for a really small brush, then I find the danger is the paint tends to dry out quite quickly on it, and so you have to keep going back to your paint and it slows everything down. Instead, you want a bit of time so you can do those smooth, graceful curves at your own pace. So for that reason, I'm going to be using my size 0 brush once again, and what we want to do is make sure the paint's thinned down correctly on the palette to a sort of slightly inky consistency. So with the water, I'm just going to start thinning it down. And in the case of doing this, having a wet palette is going to be a real big help here, because it's just going to really allow us to hold that paint at that consistency where we need it for longer than a dry palette would. What we're looking for is this sort of smoothness here. And like with an edge highlight, you can always have a go at testing it on your palette and seeing how smoothly it flows from the brush. That's going pretty good just there. And also, if you want to, you can always have a bit of a practice on the palette itself to get yourself into the right headspace for these sorts of swirls. But once the paint is thinned and ready, we can then get going. So for this sort of thing, what we should do is avoid starting on this part of the horse just on the back here, because it's a nice open space, but because it's so large, it'll have a tendency to make us do the swirls quite large there. So we need to start in a smaller region to get our head around the size they need to be, so we can then take that pattern elsewhere. So for that reason, I'm actually going to be starting on this lower part just down here. And what I'm going to do is just start by painting a swirl, starting just here, disappearing underneath that part of the fabric, coming down, and then I'm just going to curl it around as smoothly as I can, there, like that. There we go, everybody. That's the first one put on just there. Now, this is going to be merely the starting point, because from here, what we want to do is start building the pattern out. And that means splitting it every now and then. So it's going to come out to another swirl there like that, which I'm purposely making smaller. There we go. And then this one, we can add one that kind of curves the opposite direction there like that. So that's the general thing that we're looking to do. And the idea is just to work our way across the area, just doing this kind of thing, just filling in the gaps as we go. Now, if any mistakes are made, it's just a matter of mixing up that original green that's underneath it and using that to clean things up. But it is just a case of just taking your time, not rushing it, just gradually working your way around, just adding more of these curves in as you go along. I finished applying that initial vine pattern there onto those two regions, and there are one or two little bits I think need tidying up and just cleaning up before moving on, but I'm quite happy with how that's looking, and I'm definitely getting into a rhythm of it and get a hang of the sort of size these swirls need to be. I've also noticed a thing that really helps out, and that is on the outer edge of this pattern. If you run the colour of your choice here into this recess and go all the way around the fleur-de-lis pattern like this, then actually this makes the whole process a lot easier when it comes to these narrower parts down here, because they actually work as almost like a backup for the vine pattern, because you can swirl into them and it all connects. So for example, I can do a swirl going in there like that, and you can see how it all just ties up really nicely, which means that what you can do for these little sections down here is just do a few little flourishes of this colour, and it just gives the illusion of the pattern carrying on down there. But now it's just a matter of basically carrying on doing this across all the barding and on the Green Knight. So I'm just going to take my time just adding these swirls until I'm happy, and then it's going to be time to put the banners on the back of the Green Knight and glue the miniature together with some super glue. Once that's done, it's going to be time to base it, and in this case I'm definitely going to be going for a grasslands base to match the rest of my army. And with the base now fully painted, the Green Knight is complete and ready to fight in defence of the sacred places of fair Britannia. So painting the Green Knight is lots of fun. It's a really, really nice miniature. It's got lots of detail on there, but not overly so you can really push yourself if you want to, but you certainly don't have to because it actually has quite a small colour palette on there. Now, it's a great experience as well, picking out all the various details, and of course the vines are part of that. And remember, these are entirely optional. You don't have to do it, but if you decide you do want to do it, a great thing to do is to practice on some of the smaller layers on the barding of the horse, just to get used to the pattern, and definitely make sure you run that green into the recess that appears just around the edge of the pattern, because if you do, it's almost like a little cheat in that you can sort of move some of the swirls into it, and it gives the illusion that they go much further than they actually do. So definitely make sure that you do that. But for me, doing that was actually a big hurdle because honestly, I've put off doing that for years and years. So here we are finally doing it, and on a painting video, no less. So I've really enjoyed it. It's been a great experience to push myself for it. And I suppose it just stands to reason that if there's a model out there that you really like, that you've been putting off painting for years and years because you're worried about it, well, don't be worried about it. Just get the miniature, have a go. You'll be surprised. So have fun, and we'll see you again very soon.